Welcome to Article 6 conversation with Edmund Rice, youth workers and staff. In regards to Article 6, you have rights by law wherever you go. So let's get started. I'm going to go around. You guys can introduce yourself, what you do, that sort of thing, and then we'll jump into the conversations.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a youth programs coordinator at the Edmund Rice Center, and I was born in Afghanistan.
I'm Natasha. I'm the CEO of Edmund Rice Center, and I was born in Yugoslavia.
Hi, my name is Lueth, and I'm a youth programs coordinator at Edmund Rice Center, and I was born in South Sudan.
And my name is Ndayikeze. I was born in Burundi, and I'm a youth programs coordinator at Edmund Rice. All right, so let's get started right into it. So let's talk about the article. You have rights by law wherever you go. What does that mean to you guys?
Now, it's interesting because, of course, we always look at, as human beings, we should have inalienable rights. So be able to uphold the Declaration of Human Rights wherever you go. And we know that doesn't happen everywhere in every country. So at the moment, I think people do look at this as a guiding set of principles, and they can be dismissed sometimes if the local laws are, I suppose, not accepting of it. So I suppose in some countries, the laws do differ, rights do differ. So depending on who you are, where you're from, same thing if you're a citizen of the country or if you're not a citizen of the country. So to me, I think having rights wherever you go, it's kind of an idealistic idea, but it's definitely something that I think in Australia, if we look at it right now under this current situation, I think we'll get into talking about COVID-19 and how it's impacted everything. It's actually quite interesting to look at this article specifically and look at how that safety, security, and obviously this human right actually coexists.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else?
I could jump in a little bit in there. So I think you have rights wherever you go. I think first and foremost, you have to have the protection of the law. So it doesn't matter in what country in the world you are, you have to be protected by law. And if you ever have to sort of get in trouble for anything, then you have to have the right to a fair trial. I think that's the most important first and foremost. Secondly, you have the right as a person. Doesn't matter what part of the world you are. So whether that is the right to education if you're a child, or I guess the right to fair working conditions, and I guess the right to a fair amount of pay and compensation for amount of work that you do. And also just the right to be, I guess, treated equally. It just doesn't really matter in what part of the world you are. If you're in your home country or you're in a foreign country, you have as much rights in a foreign country as you would have in your own home country.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dan. Lueth, I'm just going to go to you for a minute because I know you've been here for, I believe, less than 10 years. Am I correct?
Yep.
So when you came to Australia, do you feel like, how was your experience in regards to this law?
That's pretty interesting. And I felt like I actually had more rights when I came here than when I was back in Kenya, I would say. Because here, like, people do respect you as a person and respect your rights just because you are a person. But in most countries, that is not the case. You have to be respected and given some rights if only you are from that country. Mm-hmm. And some people in most countries would recognize you for what you have, who you are, what kind of background you're from. But let's say if we come to the human rights, that shouldn't be the problem. The most important thing that we all should be focusing on is the fact that we are human beings and we should be respected for that. And I felt like I've had that feeling, of safety, to be able to say what I want, so like to have that freedom of speech, to have that right to being safe. I think I found those here more than anywhere that I have been in. And because, like in my home country, South Sudan, like people just kill for, I have no idea, is it pride or is it like just, some sort of, some sort of grudges they have against who knows who did them wrong few hundred years or 50 something years before we were born, and we have to struggle, and we have to always be scared of our lives because of all that, so really knowing that you have to be protected by law, whether you are who you are being viewed as from the outside or not, just the fact that you are a human being, you have those rights, and it's a really good right to have.
Thanks for sharing, Lueth. It's definitely interesting because I guess everyone has different experiences when it comes to rights, and I think Australia is in a really awesome position to be able to respect human rights compared to other countries, as you mentioned, like your own. So what about how might this right have been contradicted by authorities recently due to the crisis? Because obviously there's been some changes and that sort of thing in terms of the law, particularly for international students. What would you say, Tash, to that?
I think I'll probably speak to it a little bit more broadly first, but the international students thing is really, really interesting. It's been very difficult, I think. So, I mean, when you look at this particular right, or rights generally, and the issue of safety or collective security, absolutely. I think, everyone envisaged this declaration to be the cornerstone of democracy and freedoms, and the idea was to make a world a better place anyway. But obviously there is a difference between individual and collective rights and freedoms in terms of security or crisis, such as the one we've just experienced. So for me, I think if we look at, say, international students, for instance, that freedom of, I suppose, the fairness under law and freedom, that still exists, and certainly the treatment of people should still be above reproach most of the time, because they're following the right thing, or the I suppose the laws of the country and the morals that are set out by the declaration. But I think in times of crisis where things have happened, migration law happens to be something that doesn't really gel well with the declaration, especially Article 6, I think, because under Article 6 you do have that exclusion of, in times of crisis, I suppose you'd have the need to get people out of the country, close borders if there's a crisis such as war, things like that. So obviously there's 29 other human rights aside from Article 6. So you've got Articles, I think 25, 28 and 29, I think they are. And one of them is around, everyone having the right to a good standard of living and basically health and well-being. And then one of them is about, the entitlement to social international order. And then, of course, duties to community. So Article 6 on its own can't be looked at as just the end all and be all. So there are articles that have those contingencies in case crises do happen. So with COVID, we saw obviously closures of borders, being able to travel between countries or go home or visit neighbours or friends. Education was stunted for a lot of people. So these sorts of, I suppose the declaration itself is still adhered to, because they're still looking at other articles mostly to do with safety of the collective, I suppose. In terms of the world, of course, these articles probably have been contradicted a little bit in some countries, perhaps. But I think in Australia, we're really, really lucky to have the potential to close borders and keep everyone safe. I think our immigration response was around keeping some of those temporary visa holders here in Australia and giving them some sort of support. And I think under Article 25, we would have given them some food and clothing, medical care, housing. Maybe the response time was quite poor. I am not sure. I wouldn't be able to tell you, but I think generally speaking, this crisis, this had really taken everyone by surprise. And so some of these articles at first may have been contradicted by the responses from government or community as well. So yeah, for international students, I think it's probably been very hard. Because of course for them to be in this country, they have limitations on work rights as well, and that would have been quite difficult, especially with everyone losing jobs and their inability to work. How would they have supported themselves, and how would the government have supported them during this time? especially when their education may have been stopped or deferred, or they've had to leave the country early. And what does that mean for resuming that relationship with the university or the country that they come from or had gone to? It's definitely something that's probably going to impact everyone for a very long time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tash. Such insight. Like, it is interesting because I don't think a lot of people also know that, especially during this time. I'm going to quickly jump to Dan. So Dan, in regards to this article, do you believe everyone has rights, that right around the globe, if human rights is human rights?
To a certain extent, yes, Bella. I think, I guess, Lueth and Tash sort of touched base a little bit in terms of Australia, but I think Australia is in a pretty good place right now. I think human rights are in a way enacted into our constitution, into our laws, and other countries unfortunately have, although enacted this as part of their constitution, but it's not really practiced very well at the moment. Especially during the COVID-19 lockdown in many developing countries right now, such as the country that I was born in Afghanistan. Right now, I guess people have the right to, I guess, go and get essentials like groceries and things like that. You cannot live without these essentials, but they are getting beaten up by police, if they do that, so you really have to sort of choose your sides. Are you gonna starve yourself to death, or are you gonna, I guess, be okay with the fact that you're gonna go outside and you're gonna get beaten up and you're gonna come? So people are having to make extremely difficult decisions in some countries right now, to, I guess, to survive. So while I believe a lot of people around the world have rights, and their rights are being protected by the country that they're living in, it's, unfortunately not the case in some developing countries.
Can any of you name or think of some or example situations in your life that are relevant to this right, whether it's been compromised? Or I know, Lueth, you mentioned the positive end where you've come to Australia and it's been all well and good. You've had the rights as a person who's come to this country. But let's talk about your own country. Is there, would you say that your rights were also, maybe any of yous actually, your rights were also not respected in terms of education and that sort of thing? Any of yous want to share specific examples, either good or bad?
Sure, why not? I'll jump in. I suppose, as I said, I was born in Yugoslavia, so I probably, I'd say during the sort of early 90s to late 90s, also through the Kosovo War. So I've gone through 2 wars, which obviously interrupted education and movement and familial ties and things like that. So things that, we value and we, I'd probably say, are given the right to in Australia. Things to do with, and I think Daniel touched on this, being able to get food and things like that. That's really, really important. But I think the important thing is also access to these essentials and things like that. So for me, I suppose during war, the right to education was certainly there, for instance, but because of obviously the border closures and ethnic war, I suppose, ethnic conflict, you would have a lot of discrimination and racism and a lot of exclusion and things like that. I suppose for this particular right, so Article 6, it's really something that I actually did think about as you sort of organised this, and I thought, this is really interesting, never thought about it. But it is true. So the law obviously didn't treat people equally, depending on which country you were in, which country you find yourself in. So for me, probably during 94, 95 and onwards, I was a refugee in Serbia. Now, refugees in Serbia at the time weren't legitimized, so you wouldn't be able to work, and they weren't accepted as such, so they didn't sort of have a program that allowed you to come in. You just kind of cross the border and just go with it. And so schooling was accepted if you were a refugee, which is not a problem. But the way that was done is obviously it just went from area to area, so you didn't necessarily have it wasn't sort of across the country, you'll have the same treatment. It was sort of depending on where you went and who you were, I suppose. The other thing is obviously because there's tensions in some countries like this, your right to a fair trial and things like that. The law looks at you very differently if you're a temporary resident, as you know, here in Australia. During the time that I suppose we were sort of as a family moving around and doing things, the law definitely was not, didn't treat us equally. So in terms of the right to employment, the right to education, certainly safety was something that was adhered to, because of course the whole idea was about providing you safety, access to housing. But in terms of government support, you weren't treated as a citizen or as a legitimate sort of migrant. And so that's something that sort of post-war you wouldn't have access to. So certainly that's one thing. In terms of freedom of movement under this law, obviously during war, that's just a crisis, a crisis thing. But even after the war, you would probably be struggling if you didn't have up-to-date paperwork. You would probably be doing this illegally and sort of moving between borders. Article 6 is really interesting in terms of these crisis things, because I think it can be just kind of, put by the wayside, and you'd be looking at sort of collective safety. But in terms of individual rights, it definitely was affecting sort of my family. I think between when you look at other countries, and Daniel really did say this properly, is, in some countries you'd have discrimination, you'd be beat up police. The police obviously treat things very differently, and we're just lucky that our police don't beat us up, they just fine us if we cross borders. But I think it's really, really interesting that when you look at that sort of collective side of things, the things you think you should be given the right to, the things you should be or you're expected to have access to during a crisis situation such as war or such as COVID, you actually have more responsibilities than you have rights. So at this point, we had responsibilities to other human beings. During war, same thing. You don't want to commit war crimes or anything like that. Same thing through COVID. I mean, your responsibilities to your neighbors and your friends and your family was keeping them safe by being isolated, by being sort of adhering to the social distancing, limiting contact. But obviously, in some countries, this wasn't the case, and certainly not something that could be, I suppose, adhered to. So, yeah, good question.
Do you think that's kind of changed now because we're not seeing as heavy wars now, or do you think the circumstances have switched to look at other areas such as, migration to different countries and that sort of thing? Like, do you think the context has changed, or is it sort of still similar, or is it based on where you are? So Australia, for instance, there's a lot of freedom, but then like Lueth said, it's quite different in other countries.
I think it's contextual, and the politics of the day really does inform how the laws are treated and how this Human Rights Declaration is implemented, I suppose. And as we know, the Human Rights Declaration didn't just come out of thin air. It did come out, from the lessons of the World Wars, World War II being exactly it. And with those sorts of lessons, I think as time has gone on, we've learned more about the need to people often don't want to leave their country, so trying to look after them in their own country, ensuring that the laws and the, I suppose, safety aspects were there. I think now things are changing because we're constantly battling corruption, and we're constantly battling safety issues and environmental disasters, and giving women and children safety and rights that they haven't had before, for instance. And I think that's probably more prevalent now because we do have so many more advocates and so many lessons that we've all lived through and we've seen. And I think, I suppose, politics, regardless of what they might be, can't ignore the pressure from the international community. But there is still, obviously, I'm a skeptic, and I'm sure Daniel would be too, that there is definitely, there is still pockets in the world where Article 6, for instance, is applied in a way where it's quite construed as they're doing the right thing, but they're actually not. So, for instance, giving rights to a fair trial, they define fairness according to potentially a traditional law that doesn't necessarily take into equality or equity. And so when they apply this article against their law, they'd probably be looking at excluding whole populations. And that sometimes happens, I think. Like in Europe, I mean, you've got the Roma population or the Gypsy population across borders. They'd have very different rights. Some obviously discriminatory, some would not be treated equally by law, and certainly wouldn't be treated in the way you and I would be expected to be treated if we went over there as as tourists, I suppose. In Australia, I think things have changed, and we've obviously seen that with our minority groups. But I think COVID has definitely put a lot of pressure on this sort of thing. So, I mean, when it comes to racism, I think we've all seen instances, which I know it's crazy, but there's people out there that have been blaming particular groups that look or sound like a group that may be Chinese or Southeast Asian, and they've actually committed hate crimes against them. And they think they're doing the right thing by telling them it was their fault that COVID happened. So very strange situation. So this article has definitely been tested.
Yeah, thank you for that. You've actually kind of like touched into the next question, which is, should the law step in or become involved more seriously in issues arising as a result of COVID and the pandemic, such as hate crimes, racism, so as to protect this right to a greater extent? And maybe I might get Lueth to look into that.
Yeah, thanks for that. Really, this one is a little different from all the things that we've experienced, and and I'm pretty sure like we all are like trying to like deal with it in our different ways. Most people, I would say, like have the information that they really didn't get by themselves off the internet, or like or really of the actual report. They just hear things around and then make a whole conclusion on that, and then start judging people and all that. And of course, I've actually had a few people, a few of my friends, I would say, that that were actually like kind of targeting the Asian communities, especially the Chinese, saying that of course it's their fault that this thing happened and da 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 da. And they were even like, oh, if I meet a Chinese person and they come to me with a mask and all that, I might, insult and all that. So I was like, look, if you look at it this way, right? If you, let's say, insult that person or punch that person, that is not going to take away Corona. They are as much scared as you are. They have no idea where this Corona came from, They are as clueless as you are. So if you just try to judge a person just based on what was done in their home country, you are no different from someone that is being racist to you for something that was done 200 years ago, which you claim that, well, I wasn't there by that time. If you are having a go at this person because, oh, this COVID came from China, and you're having a go at Chinese people, what difference do you make, We are all in this together. It's affecting them as much as it's affecting you. And even if the people that came up with it had the intention, this person don't have any of that. But really coming up to like the laws of human rights, if we start bridging this, it's actually bridging all that is actually bridging all the other articles, like the one that says that we should not discriminate people, and we should not do all this and that. But if we start, categorizing people based on what someone did from the same background, really that sounds really ugly, but that's one thing. And come to like, having to be respected or to be protected under the law. We all are experiencing that. And of course, under COVID, if you really want to be protected under the law, you have to abide by the law, because the law is been put there. But if you go against it, really you are putting yourself out there to not be protected by the law. The law can only protect you if you choose to obey it. If we've been told to self-isolate or to stay at home or to keep social distancing, while we are doing the complete opposite, we really can't be protected, can we? So, yeah, that's my take on that.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. Do you want to add to that, Tash or Daniel?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I agree with Lueth completely. Like, you know, you're looking at the law. Again, people think it's just rights, but it's actually, you've got responsibilities. So, I mean, to go to your question in terms of, you know, should the law step in or should the police step in? I mean, of course, they have stepped in to a degree. I think racism and hate crimes are very different, but very much sort of related topics. So in terms of racism, I think that's everyone's responsibility. That's not something that has a place in this world. Nor discrimination is something that naturally, I think we all want to discriminate things. So from good to bad, it's how we judge the world. It's the optics that we look through. So when someone says, what's your favorite color? You already have discriminated against the others because you know that this particular color is your favorite color. Now, when it comes to human beings, you're actually, by discriminating, you're actually putting other people at risk. You're putting yourself at risk as much as them. So, you know, if you look at the stuff that's been happening, it's very similar, and it's awful to say, but it's very similar to the things that have been happening over the years with our Middle Eastern brothers and sisters who, you know, have come to this country or have been born in Australia and, you know, third generation down the track. And they had been looked at through the optics of, you know, the Syrian war, the conflicts in Afghanistan and other countries, and obviously around terrorism and extremism. And so the way they were looked at, I suppose, under Article 6 is actually they were scrutinized more so. And that's the same thing, I think, right now when we look at it, you know, when people want to do something that's positive, they're actually discriminating. So when we're talking about, as Lueth said, you know, if someone wants to tell a Chinese person, go home, you don't belong here, it's because of you that we're all having to isolate, you're actually discriminating in such a way that you're actually putting a whole group at risk. So you're not actually doing anyone a favor, but you're also creating that gap between the communities that we've been working so hard to bring together. So when you're thinking about, you know, someone that has done something wrong, people that are being racist are doing the wrong thing. People who are doing hate crimes is even worse, of course, because what they're doing is actually going against, as Lueth said, all the other articles around, you know, safety, community rights, community responsibility, of course. And then, of course, we've got this whole idea around discrimination. I think right now people have used it as an excuse, though, to just let their sort of right-wing views a little bit loose. And people have let fear get in the way, so they've just blamed whoever looks and sounds like they had anything to do with this or their family had anything to do with this, which is quite awful, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I reflect on how Black people have been treated in Japan and all those places, and it breaks my heart to know that they're experiencing that, but it goes to show that no matter whether it's the pandemic or not, like racism and discrimination still exists, but it depends on what's in place, like things like the law, and definitely history has a play in all of that, and the fact that I think it's also people's mindsets. And like, so the next question, I guess maybe to Daniel, would be like, who, and I know sometimes it falls back to people like the government, people in positions of power, like who do you think is responsible to kind of enact this human right? Is it like a collective? Because it doesn't seem to be at the moment, but what's your take on who's kind of responsible, and what's a way that we can practice this a bit more?
That's a really, really interesting question, Bella. A really interesting question. I think when human rights was designed, I don't think it was designed with the backing of government, nor was it actually designed so that the government would be the sole body to enforce human rights. I think human rights is the responsibility of every single one of us as human beings around the world. You know, so it's not the duties of the heads of government to make sure that human rights are being followed, or I guess everyone's rights are being protected. It's my duty, it's your duty, it's everyone's duty to make sure that we treat people fairly and I guess equitably. I guess, if you have to sort of delve a little bit deeper into that, is that, human rights, in my sort of opinion, is no longer sort of a one size fits all. Like you have to look at every situation differently and sort of, act on it on the merits of that particular situation, because there are people who have, I guess, severe disabilities. There are people who have, I guess, other kind of medical conditions that if you were to sort of treat them exactly the same as me, or I guess the same as everyone else, that their rights are not, being, I guess, adequately protected, because, they have the right to sort of special care, I guess, in that sense. So I guess the short answer to that question is that it's the rights of everybody. It's in fact the responsibility of everybody to make sure that human rights are upheld and that it's protected, not just the heads of government. I guess in some countries, the governments do a really good job of making sure, that their citizens are getting the right message. I guess when you put love, for one another on top of everything else, then in that sort of, flows down, to the people of that country, to the citizens of that country, when that's being preached down by the government. When on the other hand, the government is preaching extremism, I guess this does not have to be like, like sort of terrorist activities and stuff like that. This could be like little things, such as the right to, I guess, or the freedom to choose your religion, like, I guess in some countries, like in the Middle East, particularly in the Middle East, where you cannot choose your religion, it's something that's given to you. And I guess if we have to take a moment to think about that, how wrong is that? Like, why does it still happen in the modern world with like 30 human rights that are supposed to protect everything? Like, why does it still happen where people are deprived of their sort of, that they're deprived of the fact that they cannot express themselves, and practicing a particular religion or not practicing a religion at all is a way of you as a human expressing yourself. And why does it still happen that people are being burnt alive because they're not practicing a religion, or they've chosen to speak out against the particular religion that's being practiced in that country? So I guess the government can play one role, but the government, it doesn't stop with the government, it stops with everybody. So I guess when I bring out that example of people being burnt alive, people are being burnt alive by citizens of a particular country, not a government. Sometimes the government has nothing to do with it. The citizens decide to act on their own accord and, sort of force, a particular sort of idea, whether that's religion or whatever it might be. So, I guess it's everybody. It's me, you. It's everybody's responsibility to make sure that we protect human rights.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think we need to say that louder, because I don't think some people get it. Bringing it back to the local, in terms of the work that we're doing in regards to human rights, and maybe not directly talking about it, do you also think that it's not just about a country specifically, but would you say that, maybe this is a question that you could answer, Lueth, it's that the children and youth in our program, or the adults who are newly arrived in Australia, have rights in the environments that they're in, like let's say in an English classroom or maybe out in the park? Like, do you think that also applies? And are we as staff at Edmund Rice, or people servicing others, is that something that kind of we're practicing as well, do you believe?
Yeah, thanks for that question again. That's a really good one. It's actually getting me to reflect, and it's good. Really, I would say yes, we are practicing it, and most of our participants that are coming to the park really kind of build a lot of trust and a lot of friendship that they didn't have before. So we are seeing this happening, like most of our participants becoming besties, like becoming really close friends, trusting the coordinators and all that. So this cannot be a result of, of discrimination or like breaching any sort of human right. It shows clearly that we and our programs are doing this right, we are respecting everybody regardless of where they're from. The most important thing is they're human beings and they're on our programs, and every single one of them is been given like similar opportunities with everyone. There's no one that is being put aside, said that, oh, you from this background, so you're not gonna do this, or you're a boy, or you are a girl. They are all being taught the same thing. They have the same coach, unless if we have to compromise, and that is to cater for the people. Like in Common Goal, we do have like a specific girls coach, and that is to actually cater for those families that would prefer their daughters to be coached by a girl. So really, we are actually looking at all the possible rights to make sure that all the rights have been looked after. If I would say, in my opinion, that look, training boys and girls, it's normal, and I just stick with that, then I'm actually bridging their rights. Then I'm not abiding with that. But the fact that we are being lenient, and that we are respecting their rights, and that we are ready to work with them, it shows that we are not only working with these people, but we also respect their rights, and that build a lot of respect, a lot of trust, and that is why the center is being respected, and our coordinators and our participants have really good, I would say, sort of like friendship. Usually, most students don't like their teachers. I would say that. But there's close to none, or if there are, it would be less than 2 people that have ever heard saying that they don't like the coach, or they don't like the coordinator, and that would really depend on how you interact with them, how you engage with them. Most kids would say that, man, I don't like this coach, he goes too hard on us. And then guess what? When they see you somewhere else, they're like, that's my coach. And they say it with pride, So many times I've worked at the shopping center, and I've ran into kids working with their parents, and they just run to me and they just hug me and like, Mom, this is my coach. I'm like, wow, what a feeling. We are teaching them to respect the rights of other people. So because there's this saying, like father, like son, that goes with everyone. So like teacher, like student. If your teacher does things in a way, and they try to impose that principle on you, you will grow up with that same principle. So I think what we are showing is a really good example, and the kids that we are working with are going to be even better people. And that means the next generation that will come after them will learn from them as well. So the world should be getting better and better. And in saying that, I really hope that all the other people that work with kids, especially the schools, because they have the kids longer than anyone, longer than the parents themselves. I really hope that they are trying to like go with the same message, like being good role models, like showing the kids to respect other people's rights, because the moment that you start showing a kid something from a young age, they don't know if that is right or wrong. They just know that that is what people do, and they will just keep doing that. And once someone is used to something, they don't care if it's right or wrong. They will do it anyway without controlling themselves. So if it's the right thing, or respecting people, respecting the rights of every human being, learning to like treat people the way that you would like to be treated, or treating yourself the way that you treat people, I think we can have like a really good future, I would say. And of course, these articles will not be overlooked. So
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing, because I feel like as the next generation coming up, it's important, as Edmund Rice, as we're doing, to keep nurturing these kids to know their rights, but to also have that confidence to stand up for themselves as they grow up, having that knowledge, so then they could also apply it in their own life, and also know that, because it is a neglected space, and because we're having a conversation like this, definitely starts that. So I think I'm just cautious of time. I'm going to wrap it up now, unless anybody wants to say anything else. I know I had so many other questions, but it's a question that encompasses all of the rights and needs a bigger space. But I think we've had both heavy conversations and a pretty balanced conversation. Unless any of you want to say anything else that might help the campaign, go for it.
I was just going to add one thing, Bella. So onto what Lueth was saying around, how programs that we run are, I suppose, adhering or upholding the human rights side of things, especially Article 6. So a lot of our programs, being prevention programs, inclusion programs, are all about teaching kids that, they have rights, but they also have responsibilities. But we also do take into account that equality, equity sort of dynamic, and we are looking at, if we talk about people with disabilities, or as Lueth said, in some programs, some girls, especially our Muslim girls who want to play soccer, their families are supportive, but they'd rather have a female coach. We obviously, provide that. Why? Because it's really, really important for us to be able to, I suppose, provide that kind of safety aspect, as well as giving them that idea that you as women are actually able to make that decision yourselves and your families and all of that. I think it's also really important to remember that in some parts of Australia, some of these, especially Article 6, is still kind of not always, I suppose, respected. And by that, I mean in terms of conversations when we talk about LGBTI community, when we talk about access and equity for disabilities. I think we're getting much, much better at it now, because we've seen the lessons of what inclusion actually does, and it saves a hell of a lot of time and money and heartache for everybody if we actually have inclusion practices. But I think also when we talk about, it's a heavy topic, but things like, right to, I suppose, planning a family. So things like abortion in some states is still illegal. Whereas in other countries, same thing, it is illegal, it's punishable by law, and it's really punishable by law, and it's very extreme. In WA, for instance, we do have some mechanisms that adhere to both our constitution, our laws, but also give that individual the right to make that choice that's informed. So I think above all, Article 6 and all the other rights, the key to it is actually having the right information to implement.
All right, thank you so much, guys. This is like, honestly, I did not expect that much to come out, but you've done so well. I'm really proud of the time span when this declaration was made. Natasha, our CEO, Lueth, who runs the Commonwealth Project, and also Daniel,
really happy people, really good people, law-abiding citizens, but people
so
that can
thank you
actually
so much,
advocate
guys,
for themselves and their community, not just participate in group lynchings, as Daniel said. I think it's really, really important to actually have the correct information out there for them and what this means for their futures, because I think if you alienate one right for one person, you actually do it for everyone else. It sets a precedent.
No, thank you for that. That definitely relevant. Dan, anything else? I'm going to wrap it up because I know it's...
No, I was just going to say that's a really, really strong point at the end. If you alienate the right of one person, you sort of set a precedence for, the rest of, like the people out there. So that's a really strong point.